Welcome to our study of the Buddhist Psychology of Awakening by Steven Goodman. And I should right away say I've had some issues with internet. So it has been a little bit on and off with the webinars and the Zoom meetings as of recently. So just so you're prepared, there might be some sort of unexpected interruptions, but at the same time, it works more than it doesn't work. So I didn't really I didn't really feel there was a reason to not go ahead. And so I'm just going to dive straight into the material, which is essentially working with the conditions that are going to be favorable on the path to enlightenment. So we've looked at the conditions for our perceptions in terms of the dhatus. We're looking at how the mind interacts with objects and how we create conscious experience. And now we're looking at the conditions where we could be proactive in terms of establishing favorable conditions for the practice of the path. And of course, very often in the modern discourse, there's a sense that you have the practice of meditation. If you meditate, then you're going to get enlightened and all of that. But it's a bit more than that, because we also need to integrate the entire the entire array, the entire dimension of our actual felt and experienced being, which is really how we operate 90 however many % of the time, which is our everyday life. And that's where we are not just meditating all the time. We're having conscious felt experiences, psychological experiences, etc. And we're not in the Buddhist path. We don't really see just what happens to us psychologically as something that just happens to us. We are proactive in terms of essentially directing our attention. And of course, we have impulses, we have reactions and so forth. That happens all the time. That's a given. But we could also very well have a vision of what are the wholesome factors that really construct on one hand, you could say the foundations for general happiness. And of course, in this context, we're also talking about the path of enlightenment. But there's a lot of overlap between what we could call happiness and well-being and the path to enlightenment. Obviously, they're in no way disconnected. Of course, the path to enlightenment looks far beyond the ordinary scope of what we've been brought up with in terms of what is the nature of our human disposition. But at the same time, what we appreciate within our culture as things we could call honesty, truth, decency, kindness, all these kind of things, they're just as much part of the path to enlightenment. So there's not really as if these operate within two different realms. You could say one just goes a little bit further. And that's, of course, implicit within what we understand with enlightenment in the Buddhist context. So presently we are operating or looking at mental factors, but particularly then you could say an array of very constructive mental factors that and apologize for the vocab, but we are struggling to find other words. We're talking, I think Steven refers to these as wholesome mental factors. So if you can bear the fact that we're cultivating wholesomeness, I hope that's not too uncool. And also, in general, the notion of virtue, we need to actually have some sense of there are psychological conditions which really are powerful in terms of establishing the conditions for happiness and enlightenment. And that's where virtue actually is a term we could use on the path. Of course, we have, and this is of course a recurring theme, we have a little bit of disgruntlement. We're a little bit associate sometimes the practices of cultivating virtue. We associate that with hypocrisy. We associate that with corrupt institutions, etc. But that has more to do with individual practices. Hypocrisy, institutions, and so on, they're prone to human error, human shortcomings, but the actual nature of all these qualities that we're talking about here, faith, conscience, shame, etc., all of these, they have a very real role in terms of us governing our own lives. So it's not something that we just poo-poo just because there has been failure that we can identify in others. These are genuine qualities that are very helpful for ourselves. So just a little sort of how do you say, preamble here, and I'm sure Steven will argue much more substantially for the value of this. We're presently looking at this very provocative term, which is shame or decorum, and that has to do with this is what I think we translate this elsewhere as decorum and shame. So that has more to do with, we looked last time at conscience, which is really where you could say we stand in relation to ourselves. This is more how we conscience is something where we are aware ourselves of what's going on. In the case of shame and decorum, this is more in the view of others. But that also applies really, and we would be sort of rather alienated to ourselves if we insisted that we don't care about what we sort of how we project within a societal context. So I'm just going to go over the last paragraph that we covered last time, because I think that's probably helpful in terms of opening today's discussion. Steven says, I think we might refer to both self-respect and also decorum. So we're presently discussing decorum specifically as the Buddhist equivalent of what in the West are called healthy boundaries. How might a Buddhist practitioner engage in healthy boundaries? The response might be that one is learning to work with provocations to engage in unwholesome activities. And when we don't, that is wholesome. So we're always sort of being invited. We could very often respond to situations in terms of our habitual patterns, and particularly negative habitual patterns, which would be then what we could call unwholesome activities, not from the point of view of there's some absolute God or authority that has declared this is wholesome and this is unwholesome, but simply just from the point of view of our individual experience, our individual experience of what really makes us happy and what makes us more open-minded, more flexible, more soft, etc. Just basically what feels good. That's more what we mean with wholesome, as opposed to unwholesome, that which closes us down, leaves us feeling more hurt, aggressive, alienated, etc. So then Steven brings into discussion Longchenpa, who's a great master of the Mahasandhi or Great Perfection tradition, who wrote extensively really on the Buddhist teaching, and whose writings are regarded as extremely sublime. He was essentially a hermit who spent most of his life in retreat, and his writings were never sort of the kind that you sit down and sort of compose with a lot of reflection and sort of scribbling out and crossing out and redoing and cutting, pasting and all of that. We say his writings really flowed effortlessly. And so he left an enormous amount of writing, but never as a scholar, but more from somebody who, as a sage, was able to perfectly articulate the Buddhist teaching effortlessly. So in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, Longchenpa has a tremendously high, there's a lot of regard for him. So presently then discussing decorum, then Steven says, the key to this, again based on Longchenpa, is that only when these wholesome factors are alive and present in us can they help to stabilize the factor of confidence. In other words, it's very difficult to have confidence if we don't have the habit of self-respect and decorum, if we do not respect ourselves. So that, of course, is not a statement we could just take at face value, but this is something we can investigate ourselves. If we have something we want to, if we have this inner sense of self-respect and decorum, then we have a natural confidence. if we're failing in regards to what we actually believe in, it's difficult for us to have respect for ourselves, and then it's also difficult for us to have confidence. And that's very often where we act from a very toxic perspective, or we act from a very toxic place. When we lack that confidence, then we're acting out of insecurity and a sense of failure, and a lot of, you could say, afflicted attitudes really permeate that condition. So Stephen continues, Longchenpa says, when decorum and self-respect are present, they support the emergence of confidence. This suggests that if there's a defect in our confidence, we should perhaps look at these factors of self-respect and decorum. Maybe our way of working with what we imagine to be wholesome and unwholesome, for example, the adoption of moral phrases such as thou shalt not, may feel a bit coercive and externally imposed and not corresponding to our nature. And that's, of course, true. Within the modern conversation, this sort of these kind of prescriptions, thou shalt do this or thou must do that, and very often, people, they'll ask me, as a Buddhist, are you allowed to ... as if there was some sort of rule that, as a Buddhist. And of course, yes, there's definitely guidelines, but it's really all founded on understanding cause and effect in terms of personal experience. So the whole sort of idea is here in the Buddhist context is really founded on us being able to identify the logic and the sense that these kind of actions really constitute. So Stephen says, Longchenpa goes on to say that if we have self-respect and decorum, and we're really experiencing this confidence, then we're in a good situation to benefit from the presence of a spiritual friend, a teacher. So that again applies. If we have trust in ourselves, we can trust in others. If we don't have trust in others, then, or rather, if we don't have trust in ourselves, then it would be very difficult for us to have trust in others. So we appreciate really how our ability to not just work with teachers, but also relate to people, relate to family and friends and so on, works so much better when we have these conditions of self-respect and decorum. Stephen says many problems regarding the ability to working well with a spiritual friend or teacher could be traced to an interruption or a lack of stability in terms of our own self-respect, our own decorum, and our own confidence. This is an interesting point, because particularly these two terms, really decorum or shame and so on, they're very often seen as being rather unfashionable, archaic, and essentially laced with potential sense of guilt and sort of an unhealthy psychology, which, again, like I was saying earlier, sure, if these exist in a sort of institutionalized way, or if we're sort of disappointed with them in terms of how others have handled these mental factors, it doesn't mean that they don't have a value. Okay, non-attachment, another widely misunderstood term. Very often, the notion of being a Buddhist means that you don't really give a toss about the world, and you then hide that under being not attached. Like, I'm not going to care for anybody. I'm not worried about anything because I'm so terribly detached. So that's not really what is meant with non-attachment in a Buddhist context. It particularly, more than anything, it really refers to not being attached to our own selfish agenda. Anyway, so then it goes on to say, now we move on to the fourth factor, alobha, which is translated as non-attachment. It is the first of three factors, which include non-attachment, non-aggression, and non-delusion, that are wholesome factors that seem to have their definition, as their definition the absence of unwholesomeness. Okay, this is something to think about. That is, the absence of these factors, not having attachment, aggression, or delusion, is said to be positive. This is actually really significant, because we could say, what is virtuous actions? What's positive action? What's negative actions? Well, that's really, you could say, very subjective. What is positive for us? Let's say that I decide to 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 clean up my room. That actually is bad news for a lot of the inhabitants in my room, including spiders, um, mice, ants, and sort of various sort of uninvited, sort of the uninvited, but nevertheless, little individuals who actually view this as their place. Now, I might be seen as being, I might think that I should, as a sort of a good person, keep a clean apartment, and people coming to my place and they see it's completely messy and overgrown with mold and dust and what have you, they might see that as being sort of a negative condition. Sorry. Um, so so that's where I might think I'm going to do something positive, but for others, this is not positive at all. This is negative. So we would really say, what is it that defines positive and negative? And that is essentially the attitude behind it. So, so, so that's where all the various acts that we can think about, they're not really positive and negative in and of themselves. It's about the attitude behind them. I mean, what I'm saying is fairly obvious. I hope I'm not making confusing by saying too much, but it's really important to understand the notion of virtue and what is positive actions. This is really certainly from a Buddhist context, and also certainly from our own experience, we can see it has everything to do with the attitude that's behind it. So maybe sometimes we have laws that we might not like, or as parents or caregivers, we might say no at a time in a context that might not make us particularly popular. So that's where what is negative and positive is very subjective, but we can have that certainty that we are doing something good if there is an attitude behind that is not laced by aggression, that is not laced by a self-centered attachment or just simply ignorance. So Steven says, the absence of these factors, not having attachment, aggression, or delusion, is said to be positive. He says, we can remember what positive means in this context, and that it is translated in different ways: wholesome, good, or positive. As we said, there are factors that help to move us along the path in the direction of going beyond all suffering and sources of suffering. Or rather, these are factors that help us to move along. It does not at all mean these are factors that make us feel good. Feeling good is not the basis for deciding what is positive, nor is feeling bad a basis for declaring something is unwholesome. This is, of course, another discussion. This is our virtuous actions, are they the ones that make us feel good? No, that's where we would generally say virtuous actions comes from a more aerial perspective that takes into account the others. So that's where we would say that in a societal, general, conventional context, that just virtue, just in terms of making us feel good, doesn't really quite cut it. But we have to have an awareness of, you could say, the larger good. Of course, this is something that can be debated to quite an extensive degree, particularly in the sort of modern individualistic societies, where very much there's a sense that I have to be true to myself, or whatever it might be, the sort of individualistic agenda. Particularly here also, what we're then Stephen is, and of course what's implicit in the Abhidharma is also we're talking also about the Buddhist context of the path to enlightenment. So Stephen continues, though we mentioned this before, it probably bears repeating, both wholesome and unwholesome are defined in the Buddhist context in terms of the goal of Buddhism, or we might say more precisely in terms of the goal of spiritual being, which is to come to a certain settled presence of spacious awareness that is beyond all upset forever. This is sort of a nice way of phrasing what we mean with enlightenment or liberation, right? But that's it. This is really settling into an awake condition that, yes, ultimately is free from the ordinary conditions of upset, and not just sort of temporarily as a sort of a nice feeling, but really as getting to the root of things. So Stephen continues, it is to become liberated from suffering and its sources. For now, it's enough to know that these factors called positive move us in that direction. If we don't have confidence or trust that this is so, that lack of confidence or trust itself may upset us, which we will talk about shortly. Now, this is then the first one. Now, specifically to the factor called non-attachment. What is it? Non-attachment is the state in which one is not attached to anything that occurs in this life and all the things involved with it. Okay, that's there you go. That's sort of a, yeah, I guess so. Let's just see what he says. In fact, many Tibetan Buddhist masters have said that the primary difference between an ordinary being and one who really has a spiritual calling, one who may be, as it is said in the Buddhist text, on the path, may be linked to this factor of non-attachment. Of course, this is again where a different perspective comes into play, because in the Buddhist context, we don't really see our existence as contingent on the physical, but on the intangible dimension of mind or consciousness. And that, of course, is where the primary concern really has very little to do with just the phenomenon that exists as this present life, but really takes a much, what you could say, much broader, far-sighted perspective. So that's where the attachment to this life is seen as somewhat futile. So this is of course when we're talking about Buddhism really in terms of really this, you could say, wider, or this sort of a different science really that has a very different perspective from the one we're used to. So Stephen says, it is said that ordinary beings do everything as if only this life matters, a way of being that is oftentimes purported by the wrong view that there is only this life. Of course, we can't blame people when they really only think in terms of this life, because this is pretty much what we've been brought up with. But then again, looking beyond just our own culture, we can see there is, in most other cultures, some attribution to the value of what comes beyond this life. So Stephen says, being not attached means one has discovered a way of being in which one is not so obsessed or involved with the various things that arise in this life. So that's, again, this is where we're not too concerned about what is seen as being essentially rather sort of short-lived, passing, and really inconsequential, pointless phenomena. Of course, this is what we in the modern world sort of celebrate as my existence and my life, and there is only one life, and so on. So again, here we have to take into consideration really the difference in perspective. Stephen says, we might take solace from what Trungpa Rinpoche once asked. What might it look like on the ground, concretely, to not be so attached to this life? To this, he suggested that it's not that we're indifferent or unaware. It's not that at all. It's that we find a way to go through life that's a bit more workable. If we talk about driving a car, at some point we're learning to drive a car. If at some point when we're learning to drive a car, we have to learn how to turn corners. In the beginning, of course, when we are just learning to drive, we pray that all the roads will be straight. But at some point, there comes a special teaching that sometimes, even if you don't want to drive on a curvy road, those curves are there. And if you want to go on that road, you must find a way, even though it doesn't correspond to our nature or our beliefs about the way things should be. Maybe turning ourselves in our car in a somewhat coordinated way with the curvature of the road of life as it actually presents itself is not such a bad thing. So this is not really a discussion entirely about, beyond this life or not, but it is really about us simply being non-attached from the point of view of being able to adapt to what is, and not being necessarily attached to what we think should be. So that's where Lenny Bruce, he famously is supposed to have said, I've actually Googled it, there's some, not entirely sure, but you know how things get quoted, right? Anyway, Lenny Bruce once said, the truth is what is, not what should be. What should be, what is it? He used the rude word there, I can't remember exactly which one, but he says, what should be is a ... lie. So that's where we have to cope with what is very different from how we would think things ought to be. So that's where, yeah, I can't remember the word to use. It wasn't that rude actually, but anyway. So that's where it's simply non-attachment has a lot to do with our flexibility. So Stephen continues here. In the beginning, we might be shocked when a turn in the road comes. This turn in the road is sometimes called a problem or a situation that has to be dealt with. When we say that, we're already a bit upset. What does it mean that, what does there have to, why does there have to be such a situation? My idea of the road is that it should be straight. And I had a plan that was a straight plan. I had not planned to go on a road that had turns. If we're a more seasoned driver, we know, of course, that many roads have turns. This is an American speaking. Mind you, driving in San Francisco, that's pretty challenging, actually. Anyway, we may, Steven comes from the East Bay of San Francisco. So he says, we may insist and demand a full and complete map of precisely where and when every turn will come. The analogy is almost obsolete now and with the advent of GPS, but the analogy still holds, especially when that GPS suddenly fails, right? That map better correspond to what the actual landscape is. But if you talk to somebody who's been around for a while, they will say, we will do our best, but there is no guarantee. Actually, when we're buying stuff and people say that, that's kind of almost, you kind of actually appreciate that rather than somebody who just makes a blanket statement like, it'll all be fine. Don't worry, this product that we're selling you, it's fail-safe. We're sort of more prone to actually trust people who say, well, you know, we can't give you any guarantee, but, you know, it might just work. And we sort of might trust a bit more. Steven says, attachment to how we imagine events should occur makes us a bit shaky. In fact, what we might call this life consists only of events. Non-attachment is learning how not to be so attached to what occurs in this life. It's a very deep thing. One more thing to mention about non-attachment is this. Now that we know how pervasive its importance is it operating and present only when there are moments of not being so obsessed or attached? Not being attached is a positive actual presence of something that is real. The Abhidharma text goes on to ask, what is its function? What's so positive about it? When we say function, I want to be very clear what we mean here. This is an energy packet. This is an actual vivid living presence of something that's real. It's not a mental thing according to these traditions. So it says something nice and startling. It says that the function of non-attachment is that when it is present, it serves as a basis for us not being so easily caught up in unwholesome activity of any sort whatsoever. This is not a small thing. And this is also where we could make a little sort of a pitch for meditation, because meditation is essentially the practice in which we begin to cultivate the ability to let go of what we ordinarily fixate on, which is the inner narratives, dialogues, attitudes, and so on, which we very often take for being just cemented firmly as being what we stand for, what we are, and so on, where there's this component of rigidity. And being able to let go of that is actually you could say, the place within our subjective person where we actually are capable of practicing non-attachment. So that's where non-attachment doesn't come as some external directive. Okay, should be non-attached. Okay, a good Buddhist is non-attached. Okay, but that's tough. I don't know if I want to be non-attached, you know. And that's why we then have sort of a little bit of a war going on, or a conflict. But the moment actually that we have a flexibility from within, then we're able to actually validate what is constructive, what's not constructive. We can validate it might be constructive to sort of negotiate circumstances without being too rigid about it. So that's where the practice of meditation is very, very helpful in terms of cultivating this. And this, of course, also then goes for the next wholesome, what do we call them? Wholesome factor, which is non-aggression. I'll just see if there's some. The confidence that Longchenpa mentioned, is it the first factor of faith, or is it confidence in how we use it in English, like he is a confident person? It's actually both. And there's not really any difference between these two. Confidence simply enables us to have confidence in ourselves. And it's on the basis of having confidence in ourselves that we can also trust others. So it's not just faith in terms of faith on the path, but it also implies this sort of confidence in terms of just having this grounded quality of respecting ourselves. Of course, we might sometimes think a confident person is just somebody who gets what they want, or who sort of is charismatic or something. But what we could, and this also equally applies in the English language, a confident person could very well be someone who is at ease within him or herself on the basis of having self-respect, on the basis of decorum. And then non-attachment, learning to just let go of wanting to control everything. Yeah, that there's definitely a correspondence between that. It also is about not just that particular impulse of wanting to control everything as in a control freak, or the sort of the wanting to be in charge, but in general of any, actually to be able to let go of any mental fixation, really, any degree of rigidity. And ultimately, this actually leads to the greater vipassana that no longer solidifies the notion of self and also the notion of external phenomena. So non-attachment here can go very far, actually, in terms of the practice of the path.
I remember what you said before, Jakob, about the
There's a story of a sage called what is it again? Kongpo Ben. So it's in Words of My Perfect Teacher, where Ben was expecting his patrons to show up, and so he arranged his shrine very nicely, and he arranged his room very nicely, with the sort of the thought that once the patrons show up, they'll see what a virtuous and good hermit I am. And then he sort of realized, gosh, I'm a really corrupt practitioner, sort of trying to hypocrite, basically. And so he took a handful of ashes and just sort of threw it over his shrine. And and in Words of My Perfect Teacher, it's interesting. This is so sort of unusual, but it says nearby there was a great sage called Padampa Sanjay, and he was aware of this thing that was going down with this hermit called Kongpo Ben, and he declared that this offering of ashes on the shrine of Kongpo Ben is one of the most meritorious actions of virtue that, you know, incredibly virtuous, basically. He sort of, how do you say, endorsed it as being hugely beneficial, this sort of,
It takes confidence
yeah,
on a
so
level, doesn't it?
yeah. So yes, then non-aggression, non-hatred. So now we come to the fifth factor, advesha, translated as non-aggression or non-hatred. Non-hatred is the absence of the intention to harm living beings. There's a lot to be said about this. And yes, so it is also the absence to engage in arguing or quarreling in situations that we find frustrating. Non-hatred is also the absence of engaging in causing suffering for those whom we regard as the cause of our frustration. Thus, non-hatred is the absence of inflicting suffering on those who cause frustration in us. This is something positive. And it is said that it functions when it is present to serve as a basis for not getting caught up in what we might call bad karma, something that will be bad for us in the future. It goes on to say that this non-hatred or non-aggression is the awareness that in some situations we have no intention whatsoever to pay it back, to inflict it upon others. And this is considered a good thing. It's good for us and good for others. I know Chögyam Trungpa, he would sometimes say non-aggression is almost the essence of the entire Buddhist path, because that is where we're sensitive to the nature of reality. I can't remember exactly how he phrases this, but certainly this non-aggression is essentially where we discontinue our rigidity in terms of how we understand the universe. And this is where we essentially open up to reality. And this is also what Stephen essentially then concludes here, where he says this is considered a good thing. It's good for us and for others. But non-aggression is very often how we understand Buddhist conduct. Like we would say, the view in Buddhism is dependent arising. The practice is the practice of, is on one hand meditation, and on the other hand, the practice is engaging with the world in a non-aggressive way, tsewa meba in Tibetan. And this means that on the basis of understanding the complexity of phenomena, then we're no longer prone to push our particular projection onto the world. And in this way, we engage with the world from a perspective of seeing the world and understanding the world as we see it, with the humble recognition that it is exactly just us who's seeing the world in this particular way, and others might see it differently. And hence, we don't impose our particular version of the world on others. And that's where this non-aggression doesn't just come from sort of a nice peace-loving attitude of let's all love each other in sort of the the Aquarian sense of the word, but more in the sense of really just from the point of view of seeing clearly, which of course also, let's give it to the Aquarian generation that this in fact of course also might have been the basis of hippie philosophy, but it's definitely not prescriptive. And that's where non-aggression is not just that you should be good again, but really comes from a place of seeing basically seeing reality. So it's of course also being patient when there are people who are causing us suffering. Then also we don't respond just with the sort of annoyance that we might feel, but we do it with an increased awareness of the other. And that of course is where we engage with the other, however knowing they might be, with an awareness of what the other is experiencing, the reality from the other's perspective. So this is huge, and this is good for ourselves, it's good for our own sanity, it's good for us being effective in terms of achieving what we want, and of course also it creates good relationship between ourselves and others. Is there also a story of a great master who threw his mala down and vowed never to chant another mantra again? There's actually two stories like that. There was oh, what's his name again? Of course, the great Sakya master, the great Abhidharma master, um, Birupa. Birupa practiced a particular deity for some time and just didn't get any siddhi from it. This is way back in, we're talking 6th century India or something like that. So, so he actually threw his mala, not just he threw it down, but he threw it in the toilet. and, and it's then actually where Vajrayogini then appeared to him and says, well, you know, it's because you've been propitiating the wrong deity, mate. And you should be you should be practicing my sadhana instead. So that's where there was that instance. And then we also have the instance of a great master called Togten Shaka Sri. And Togten Shaka Sri was a great Dzogchen master. And it's said that when he arrived in Yalong Shedrak, this is probably late 19th, early 20th century, he came before this great statue of Guru Rinpoche. And let's just make it really clear that Togten Shaka Sri was a great master of Mahamudra Dzogchen and had practiced a lot of recitations and really, you could say, perfected all the sadhana practice that there was, and at this point was a highly realized being. And at that case, then he really, as you could say, a commitment to the highest discipline, which of course he had arrived at on the basis of all the gradual path. Then he put his mala, he didn't throw it on the ground, but he actually placed the mala in the lap of Guru Rinpoche and then vowed that I shall from now on abide by the highest discipline. And implicitly, yes, no more chanting of mantras. So there's these two. And then I heard in a teaching somewhere that if we feel others are annoying us, we are in fact annoying ourselves. Well, that's very true. We are, in fact, what we are, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In fact, we are projecting onto the other. So so what we see as annoying in others is really us basically regurgitating our own karmic phenomena. So this is where we need to recognize these are projections. That's right. Okay, mundane question coming up. Okay. I have a lot of ants in my house, and they come immediately anytime a drop of food is left out. I try not to kill them, and once even let them finish eating a drop of cheese, but mostly I just take a tissue and wipe them away, trying not to apply pressure to kill them. What should I do? Well, it looks like you're doing really well. And of course, just try to be as considerate as possible. I mean, there might be at one point a complete infestation where sometimes people need to call in, what are they called? The termite, what's it called? The sort of people who come and eliminate vermin, right? So yes, that happens. And that's, of course, hugely sad. But until then, let's try just being as gentle as possible, and even if we do need to sometimes exterminate, little persons, then we at least pray for them and try to sort out every other avenue until we do that. I remember once in France where I was living in this tower, place called La Sonnerie, which was actually Dilgo considered, which is residence in France. But just underneath the floorboards, there was this huge nest of hornets, big, big wasps, right, about this big, was at the time of the year when they weren't out. So they weren't actually attacking anybody. But just in case, we sort of doused them with a bit of smoke. And then also we managed to get them out onto a vehicle outside, who then took it out into the woods and then left the nest out in the woods. So with a lot of attention, then we avoided then actually exterminating. But of course, it's not always possible. And I have plenty of friends who are deeply anguished when they need to actually address this kind of inevitable situation. So that's where the best we can do is do our very best up until the end. And then if we do have to exterminate others, then let's make lots and lots of prayers for them. So yeah. So yes. And sometimes also, if we address these problems early on, that's before it sort of evolves into something even greater. But it's very complex. And again, this comes back to what we have been discussing, what is positive and negative, and it has so much to do with the attitude behind. So there's a big difference between somebody who takes great pleasure in killing ants, like sometimes you hear about these horrific situations where maybe out of ignorance, some people, they just think it's great fun to kill little ants or step on ants or do things to little persons that just because they're not as big as us, they then deem need to be sort of eliminated, and actually taking pleasure in it. There's a big difference between that and then going through every conceivable measure really to avoid that situation. So there's a big difference. The action might end up being the same, namely exterminating, but there's certainly, and it's not as if exterminating then doesn't come with a particular karma, but the karma is much less when the action is, you could say, prompted by an attitude behind that really is non-violent, non-aggressive. Okay, so non-delusion, non-deludedness. Okay, there's a moha. This is interesting because we sometimes talk about avidya, and then there's a moha. And avidya means ignorance, and that's the first factor of the 12 links of dependent arising. This is really the first factor that prompts or precipitates samsara. This is simply just unconsciousness. And that's a very neutral factor in the sense that it's just getting lost. Then there's a moha, which has more to do with us just being plain old dull, just being not sort of very switched on. So but there's different ways then of interpreting this. I have to say, I'm saying this without having being entirely, let's just see what Steven says. But anyway, there's this distinction. So Steven says the sixth factor, amoha, is translated as non-delusion and non-deludedness. It's kind of a catch-all term. Non-delusion is said to be active when there's a thorough understanding that comes from having received spiritual instruction, having thought about them deeply, and then coming to an understanding of their import. When there is a thorough comprehension of the instruction we have received, this is called being non-deluded. And again, like the other two, it serves as a basis for not becoming involved in unwholesomeness. So this is basically being at a place where we know something. For example, we know that it's negative to be aggressive to others. We know that it's positive to be helpful to others. And then we might just, having received this and actually having decided, yes, I really should be a kinder person, I really should be a more patient person, having received that instruction, we then might just sort of toss it away for a moment. And that is then where we sort of ignore that. So Steven says, one studies so as to become clear about the subject matter, to be clear about the goal or the target. But study is never enough. When you do engage in target practice, it doesn't mean simply identifying the target. There is something more involved. In archery, it is not the point to simply locate the target. something called a bow and an arrow are also involved, right? Having studied what a target is, that's the study part. Then you're actually encouraged to bend the bow, aim the arrow, and with a very relaxed, calm mind and body, use the eye of discriminating awareness, finally to release the arrow. Then we practice actually hitting the target. When you give these definitions here, all we're doing is listing them and how they function. We can then see whether or not we want to pursue an actual experience of these factors. But we may be surprised. Have you ever noticed that when you read what the ingredients are in something you thought you might want to eat, that list often doesn't correspond to your experience of eating it? And then for some silly reason, we get upset. It's rather a strange reaction. It's as if there should not have been a curve in the road. I'm not sure if I understand what he means. It's like you find out that it had, well, yeah, maybe you decided that you don't like beans, and you find out that you just ate a dish you really love, and then there was beans in it or something like that. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, beginners are easily upset when there's a curve in the road. Intermediate practitioners know there's going to be a curve, and they probably try to get a more precise map of where the curves will come. They might even no longer think about where the road is going to end up. But they still obsess about those curves. They want to get the essential teaching on where and when those curves will be coming up in their journey. This is kind of funny, isn't it? Yeah. Please, Guruji, can you please prepare me for every possible situation that could come up? That's what Guruji probably says. Come on, go figure it out yourself. And that's the compassionate answer, sort of. So he says, intermediate folks obsess about getting teachings about those curves, those possible pitfalls. They might feel that armed with such a map, they're not going to be so surprised when they hit a curve. But quite often, they don't negotiate the curve with much of a sense of panache. What do you say, panache or panache? Panache. Of confidence, but quite often they don't negotiate the curve with much of a sense of panache, of confident joy. They're rather uptight. Have you noticed? Okay, this is where we need to humbly sort of delve into our own experience of ourselves. Advanced or so-called seasoned Dharma practitioners do not obsess so much. They've learned the habit of knowing that when the curve will come, it is not certain, nor is it even reliably predictable. They may have had many years of being fascinated by secret teachings on the true nature of those curves, and they sometimes remember that relaxation and acceptance is a key. They discover that because the teachings never completely correspond to, nor can they be used to absolutely guarantee how things will be. When they hit the curve, they're not so anxious, they're not so attached, and it shows in how they take the curves. And this, of course, is where we can see generally, not just generally, but really what defines a sage is somebody that takes the curves or whatever sort of whatever comes at you in stride. As an extreme, of course, we've read about and even watch on television those who engage in extreme sports, those race car drivers who are experts at negotiating curves at extremely high speeds serve as an inspiration to all of us. But we shouldn't think that our body and car is the same as their body and car. Hence the warning, don't try this at home. Professionals only. Okay. Ngor Tatse Ken Rinpoche, the former abbot of the Sakya Ngor monastery, had a very interesting translation for the word yogis. He called them professionals. Maybe we don't have to be so uptight about those curves in the road. Okay, so there you go. A yogi is somebody who's not a complete amateur, is Naljopa. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to take the questions here. Well, let's see here. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is a comment. It's unfortunate that Buddhism has a language about mental suffering, equalizing a sense of control, fixation, and an inability to let go. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, some of the most caring and understanding people I know have mental health challenges or live with neurodiversities that Buddhism would label as being controlling. And that's not exactly true. We're talking about the condition of samsara in general here. Anyway, I've seen this happen in live teachings where those who suffer in this way have shared how damaging and uninformed this kind of language can be. A control freak or someone with a personality disorder is also highly traumatized and lives with PSD. It's not to be laughed about and judged. Just to do so is incredibly ignorant. Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I don't think anybody is laughing or judging about these conditions at all. In fact, what we're trying to do here is really address these conditions. Okay, so we'll conclude this particular section, and we'll do that with dedication. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish, ever more and more. So we'll just take a 2-minute break, and then we'll begin with meditation. Okay, thank you. So, welcome back. So just a few words about Buddhist meditation, which is really very important when we're talking about wholesome factors and so forth, where it's really important to understand this principle of wholesome factors as something that we actually do on the basis of expressing or connecting with a natural abiding condition of sanity. So, for example, non-aggression. This has nothing to do with an absolute decree of aggression being negative and non-aggression being positive, even though if we were to come across these kind of decrees, we could actually probably, if we had an understanding of dependent arising and could understand, you could say, the phenomenology or just the effect of non-aggression in terms of being something that's helpful, then we could understand the value of such a decree, you know, thou shalt this and that, right? But otherwise, then we're stuck with this unfortunate thing called moralism, where really it's just like it's being slammed on us that we should be in a particular way. And that's not very helpful. It could be helpful, certainly sometimes, to just sort of, how do you say, put a lid on one's sort of frustration or anger and so on, but ultimately not that helpful. And certainly what is the objective on the Buddhist path, which is, yes, relatively temporarily the conditions of happiness, which is very important, and ultimately enlightenment, then in terms of our temporary happiness, it's very important that we come from this place of confidence and ease and being at peace with ourselves. And that's where the morals that you find in Buddhism in terms of non-aggression, non-attachment, so forth, they're not really seen as anything other than really an expression of our natural sanity. And we can also take it the other way around. When we're at ease, then naturally we are non-aggressive. Naturally we are non-attached. So this is where we understand the nature, what we're talking about here. But let's say that we actually do want to be kinder persons, or we do want to be less aggressive persons, or we do want to be one way or another, and we actually see the value of this, then it's not going to be very helpful you say, I must be like that. But there has to be rather a place where we're not in conflict with ourselves, having an impulse that takes us one way, and then a sort of a moralistic view that says we should go the other way. That's where we really are just struggling with ourselves. And that's where meditation is really helpful, because that's where the power of the thoughts actually give way to a perspective. And that's where we actually stand a greater chance of having choice, of having freedom. We're not slaves of particular impulses, slaves of particular reactive patterns. And we can also see that these reactive patterns that we have, they're so much tied up with habitual conditioning. So that's where meditation is very, very helpful. But also, it's really important that meditation is really practiced as a place where, or rather, meditation really, for that reason, I should say, meditation is not practiced as a place where you just retreat into a comfort zone where you're just sort of at ease, but really that meditation is seen as a vehicle for going beyond our ordinary habitual patterns that cause our suffering. So that's where, when we are identifying the causes of suffering, we're really doing that from the point of view that we can work with these, and we really would want to work with these. We'd want to be free of suffering ultimately. And so we're addressing these in the most skillful way. And so meditation is seen as a vehicle for really going beyond these causes of suffering. So it's not just like a nice thing where we go into a condition of peace, but really it's really a place where we could be very constructive, very creative, very proactive in terms of really getting to the bottom of what causes so much suffering. So that said, then the foundations of meditation practice in the Buddhist context, and which really is not just about Buddhism, but which is really what we could call Dharma, which is us connecting with reality. And that's where the Buddha is not somebody who developed a system. Rather, you could say the Buddha is somebody who's freed himself from systems. And the insight of the Buddha is not some particular Buddhist thing. It's really an insight into how the world works. It's an insight into reality. Just like when we say water boils at 100 degrees, this is very helpful. And of course, it's based on the kilometric system, etc. But it's really just a method for us to, or a way for us to map and understand our reality. So we don't really say according to the particular system. Of course, we might say according to the kilometric system, we say that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. But we don't understand that as a dogma. We understand that as science that's grounding in observing what can be empirically verified. It's grounded within a verifiable, or if you like, falsifiable science. So similarly, also the Buddhist teaching is never meant to be anything other than what we can observe with regards to reality. So this applies all the way through. There's not a single aspect of the Buddhist teaching that actually doesn't really address this. And this has to do with everything from just, you could say, the practice of non-violence to meditation to even the rituals or the yoga that you find in Buddhism. All of it really has the intention to connect with reality. So then we operate with these two, you could say, modalities in meditation that are known as shamatha and vipassana. And shamatha means calm abiding. In Tibetan, shine, which literally means abiding calmly, and vipassana hlaktong, which means greater seeing. So the conspicuous aspect of meditation is, of course, sitting or moving mindfully, and in general, being mindful, being present and not distracted and so forth. And that's very, very helpful in general. It's also very helpful if you're a sniper, or if you're if you're involved in crime of various kinds, you're going to be a much more successful criminal if you have great mindfulness and great sort of psychological discipline and so on. Mindfulness can basically be put to use in so many different ways. But in the Buddhist context, this quality of being present is attached to the objective and the project of vipassana, which is enabling mind to find its sanity again, to actually allow the natural abiding wisdom or lack of confusion to resurface. We could say this is the natural condition of our mind, and with the practice of meditation, we're allowing this innate capacity of insight to emerge. And that's also where, on the basis of that, then we're also able to be much more constructive in our choices. We're able to practice non-aggression, practice non-attachment, etc., without really without much difficulty, simply because there's an appreciation of that as an expression of our own sanity. So with shamatha, there's calm abiding, and with vipassana, there is this freedom from the ordinary confusion. And in the Buddhist teaching, we talk about confusion in general as us misunderstanding our subjective condition of consciousness as being a self, and also the perceived realm or the field of our perceptions as being other and as being solid matter. And that's where the Buddha's discovery was that these assumptions around self and other really are contingent on a basic confusion, a basic ignorance. And hence, with the practice of meditation, we facilitate this insight, which is then vipassana, in which there's a lessening the grip and the intensity of our delusion, which means that the outcome of vipassana in conjunction with shamatha is then this lessening the fixation on self and the you could say rigid objectification of other. And that loosening up, opening up, really is what constitutes the objective of the Buddhist practice of meditation. So when we're practicing, the objective really is of meditation is not so much for us to just retreat into a zone of peace, but really for us to begin to loosen our misapprehension, or loosen our confusion with regards to our own experience of ourselves, and also our confusion with regards to the way that we relate to the world, to the phenomenal world, to other people, to the world around us. So it's essentially opening up, and that is why we would say a genuine sage is a delightful person. The genuine sage is delightful from the point of view of the warmth with which he or she engages with the world, and also the quality of their own sanity, their own well-being. And while of course we might say, well, this sort of sage, this might be a pie in the sky, and are there such sages? This of course is always difficult, because presently we actually don't know what's going on with other people, and we're generally just thrown back on ourselves, right? But we can actually see that when we practice meditation, there is generally a sense of greater peace. The mere fact of sitting and just being physically calm doesn't harm us. The fact of sustaining presence also generally tends to minimize our confusion. So this is something that we needn't just rely on the sages as external objects of reference, but we could also refer to our own personal experience. There is, however, in the Buddhist tradition, also because this does come with an extraordinary tradition of, or traditional lineage, or whatever we call it, you can say an applied science of enlightenment, in which the Buddha was somebody that was impressive. And from the time of the Buddha, we do have what's called the Dharma of realization down to the present day. We do have rather extraordinary individuals. And for most Buddhists, there is a certain, or more or less, a large degree of appreciation for those that are viewed as sages. So it's very widespread within Buddhist context to really look to sages and respect, appreciate them, and really have them as role models, not as idols, not as saviors, but as persons who inspire and actually enable us to intuit something which is basic to us, but appreciated when in the way that it sort of unfolds in the manifest form of the sages, you could say, lifestyle. So very often, if you have the fortune to come across sages, and there are a few, just the other day I saw an incredible doco, and I think I've mentioned it before actually, somewhere in one of these webinars, a doco of a great master called Gachin Rinpoche. And just somebody actually I knew personally. I traveled as his interpreter for a couple of months a long time ago, and I think in the late 90s. But just such an extraordinary individual, and I was so happy they made this movie, which really this doco, which really conveys the beauty of such a sage. And you also have some extraordinary documentaries about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, about Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche, about Mingyur Rinpoche, Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, and others. And we could possibly meet these persons actually in the flesh. But the thing is that when we encounter these persons, there's a sense of rejoicing in what they have manifested. and connecting with this, not as setting a moral standard, I should be like that, but just a joy in seeing that something like this actually exists in the world. And that's why this is an inspiration. And we would be very cold-hearted if we weren't affected in terms of just being, you could say, softened by the presence of these kind of individuals. And that quality of being affected is what we call blessing. And so in the practice of the path, there's very often a reliance on, you'd say, the blessings of the Buddha or blessings of teachers, and very much from a very real sense of experience that actually encountering these kind of persons or thinking about these kind of persons, there's a place where the mind sort of unhinges from its ordinary habitual patterns and actually appreciates that which lies beyond the ordinary habitual way of both experiencing ourselves and seeing the world. There's a condition of softness that could take place as an experience of softness and wakefulness. And this has nothing really to do with anything mysterious. It's something that happens to us all the time, really, in terms of our encounter with the world, and where we very often experience this kind of softening. And this really is something that is very, very helpful in terms of us not just viewing the spiritual path in terms of, okay, I have to do this, I have to do that, and now I sort of managed to have a little bit of mindfulness here, and I managed to be a bit more mindful and so on, which is, you could say, staying very much within the box of our linear logic of how things progress. Actually, something like this defies the ordinary linear logic and speaks greatly about an already existing condition of innate goodness, not as something that's cultivated, but really as something that's basic to ourselves and also to others around us. So that's where the practice of meditation on one hand can be seen in terms of a gradual progression, but also in terms of us connecting with something that already exists spontaneously within our disposition. Anyway, in terms of the technique here, then there's, just to reiterate the basics, 3 aspects. One has to do with the body, which is, in the case of when we're doing sitting meditation, simply just the position of sitting, the spine straight, the shoulders a little bit back, the chin in a little bit, the gaze lowered, the jaw relaxed, hands on the knees or in the lap. And particularly, really the main point is that the spine is straight, and there's a sense of tonicity, of sort of a quality of holding ourselves, particularly with the lower back. And this doesn't mean that we need to sit on the floor. It's just as fine if we sit on a chair. But really there's a sense of just our posture really projecting this sort of wholeheartedness or wakefulness. One Tibetan teacher identified how when watching movies, it's very often when people when there's a place in the movie that's really exciting, then people very often sit in perfect meditation posture, just sort of sitting at the on the edge of their seat. Then they're sort of like, they have great posture. Then the second aspect has to do with where we place our attention or our awareness. And that is where we have to humbly recognize that our awareness tends to be rather all over the place, and we bring the attention back to the out-breath. So that's where we have a concrete object of focus that we stay with. Of course, this is something that where we quickly discover that we are having a lot of distraction, and also while we're being present, then also there are a lot of thoughts. And the point here really is, it's never about not having thoughts. It's rather just about staying focused. Just like if we're in a busy place and we're having a conversation with someone, then we stay focused on the person we're with, or if we're engaging in some work, we remain focused on the task at hand, even though there might be phone calls, even though there might be, you could say, disturbance around us, we remain focused. And it doesn't have to be particularly rigid or sort of just like a trance condition at all, but it's really just gently coming back to what we're doing. And in the same way also with the focus on the breath, this enables us to stay undistracted, even though there might be thoughts that come up, there might be memories, emotions, and all of that. That's where we are completely aware and in no way are trying to sweep any issues under the carpet in any way, but we're just coming back to this clarity of remaining undistracted, remaining present. And that's where the ordinary narratives that ordinarily have a strong grip on us, they lose some of their traction in that we're aware of them, but also not kowtowing to them, not being controlled or submitting to them. We're just aware of these impulses, narratives, storylines, ruminations, what have you, that we're aware of them without necessarily being absorbed and controlled by them. So this is simply just about us freeing ourselves and having this wider perspective. So we could say that the first two aspects that have to do with the posture and that have to do with focusing on the breath is about what we do. The last aspect, which has to do with the mind, is more about how we relate to thoughts and the thoughts that arise in the mind, which is simply just being aware of them. We say touch and go. This is a particular term then from Chogyam Trungpa, which means that we are aware of our psychological material, and yet we're also willing to see these in perspective. We let them go. We don't necessarily be absorbed by them. We don't necessarily fixate on them. So, so we'll do this, and this practice of meditation, then we do here in terms of sitting for 15 minutes, then we do 5 minutes of mindful walking, and then again we do 15 minutes of sitting, where when we do the walking meditation, then rather than focusing on the breath, we focus on the experience or the feeling of the foot touching the ground. So that becomes the object of our focus. So as we're doing walking meditation, we're simply just aware of the feeling of the footstep. So in this way also, when we're practicing meditation, we're not entangled in concepts. We're actually aware of concepts, but we're also not absorbed by them by simply focusing on that which is not conceptual. So this is a place where we come out of our heads. So despite what meditation looks like, it actually is a place of us not being absorbed, but it's also a place where we have all the ideal conditions for not being absorbed, for not being distracted. And this is not that easy. Normally, we tend to sort of get carried away by an undertow of thoughts, narratives, storylines, and so on, and we're not even particularly conscious of it. Whereas when we're sitting and meditating, we actually have the ideal conditions for being aware of what's happening with our mind. But here, rather than being absorbed by them, we're just aware of them, and we just come back then through the practice of mindfulness to a place where we're able to let go of these. So whether we're practicing coming back to the breath when we're sitting, or we're being aware of the footstep when we're walking, it effectively achieves this purpose of not being entangled, not being absorbed, and essentially not being sort of unconscious or mindless. So this enables us to come back to being properly present. So we'll do this in conjunction with then this practice called the Treasury of Blessings, which is then, like I was mentioning before, really constitutes this, you could say, the science, or constitutes the phenomenology of blessing, which is invoking this condition then of that which lies beyond our ordinary habits, and yet which is an innate condition basic to ourselves. So we'll just take 2-minute break, and then we'll begin. Thank you. So in the Samadhi Raj Sutra, it said, those who while walking, sitting, standing, or sleeping recollect the moonlight Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold. Beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering the incomparable teacher of the Lord of Sages in the following way. Okay. Now, I'd like to say something about this, because this, for us who, in the modern context, many of us have struggled with religion, then there's very much this sense that these kind of statements constitute some absolutes in which we're relying on some external savior. And this is where it's really essential that we appreciate the point that I was making early on, that in recollecting the qualities of sages, of the Buddha, of enlightened persons, and so on. We're not doing that in order to establish some sort of cosmic parental figures or saviors or whatever, but it's really to enable a condition of inspiration to take place within our own experience. So it could be that we recollect someone who really constitutes what we respect. And it's on the basis of recollecting somebody who we respect that we very often have this sense of the reality of that person, or the reality of that person's inspiration with us. So this is not really about touching, this is not really about us projecting externally, but it is really about us connecting with a place within ourselves that has that condition or disposition innately as part of ourselves. So in appreciating the Buddha, we're not externalizing the Buddha as someone who could save us, but rather appreciating the role in which the Buddha serves as a mirror for our own sanity. Of course, when we come across the discourse of Buddhism in a traditional context, then it very much aligns itself with what many of us have struggled with in terms of religion. And that's where it's necessary for us to somehow exercise some degree of being a little bit cosmopolitan, or a little bit sort of extracting ourselves from our own parochial issues, and rather appreciate the intention behind this, which is really connecting with an abiding innate disposition that ultimately is what the Buddha manifested, and which innately also is something that we possess. So that's where then taking refuge in the Buddha as the embodiment of, you could say, freedom from confusion, the Dharma as the path that enables that, and the Supreme Assembly or the Sangha as though to practice that path, is seen as a valid refuge, and also the practice of the path, in terms of what it says here, actually the merit of practicing generosity and so on, actually refers to the Mahayana practice of the paramitas, which is again actions that actually take us out of the ordinary habitual practices of self-centering, and you could say the destructive patterns. So that's where the agenda then is not just our own particular little private nirvana, but very much the agenda of enabling to be there for others. Anyway, without further ado then, so we'll chant this liturgy briefly, and then we'll practice meditation, and then we'll conclude. Okay. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness in the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. Ah, as the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence. Magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the three Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture, his right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding in his arms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The eight close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent, degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues, the body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I am accumulating now and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 Deyatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Deyatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Deyatao muni muni mahamunaya soha. Om 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 Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas, endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their conduct, engaged in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dharma Dhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity, endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules and an ethics that is completely pure. With an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not negate by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become enthusiastic and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in the Bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blaze. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to belong. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachings. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukkha nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukkha nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukkha nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukkha nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you.